Could you imagine that more than half of all people who have ever lived on Earth could be taken away by a single disease? Modern medicine has been searching for a cure for it for decades, and has failed time and again. In the jungles of Vietnam, soldiers died from this disease faster than from enemy bullets. Then the Chinese government made a decision that would seem crazy to any modern scientist. They discovered ancient medical archives that were more than 1,000 years old. One of them contained a recipe written down in the 4th century AD. For 16 centuries, no one noticed one tiny detail in this recipe. It was this detail that became the key to a medicine that saved millions of lives. A scholar named Tu Youyou read an ancient text and understood something no one had understood before. This is the story of a plant, a recipe, and a discovery that changed global medicine forever. Malaria has been around for as long as humanity has existed, and medical historian Timothy Wingard argues in his book, The Mosquito, that the disease may have killed about half of all humans who have ever lived on the planet. Just imagine the scale of this figure. No war, no plague epidemic, no natural disaster can compare to the quiet, relentless destruction that malaria has wreaked over thousands of years. The marshy plains of ancient Rome were so infested with malaria that the disease got its name from the Italian words mal aria, that is, bad air. Roman legions, having conquered half the known world, fell to pieces in the riverine lowlands faster than they could have been slain by enemy swords, and entire agricultural regions fell into ruin because the peasants were too weak to work the fields. The disease is caused by a microscopic parasite of the genus Plasmodium, transmitted by the bite of a female Anopheles mosquito. Once in the human bloodstream, the parasite penetrates liver cells, multiplies there, and then breaks out into the bloodstream where it begins methodically destroying red blood cells, causing debilitating bouts of fever, chills, and weakness. Interestingly, for most of history, humanity had no idea what exactly caused the disease. People blamed the night air, evil spirits, and putrid fumes from swamps, but not the tiny parasite, which was impossible to see without a microscope. This is why the fight against malaria remained a blind battle for centuries. By the 20th century, science finally identified the culprit and developed several anti-malarial drugs, the most famous of which was quinine, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree. However, the parasite proved remarkably adaptive. Under the pressure of drugs, it mutated, acquired resistance, and continued to claim hundreds of thousands of lives annually, seemingly defying the full might of modern pharmaceuticals. In the 1960s, the jungles of Southeast Asia became the scene of one of the most tragic military conflicts of the 20th century, and malaria fought this war on the side of nature itself. According to U.S. and North Vietnamese military archives, in some years up to 60% of casualties among soldiers in the jungle were not from combat, but from tropical fever, which knocked strong men off their feet in a matter of days. The American Army had chloroquine, a proven anti-malarial drug that had protected soldiers in tropical regions for decades. However, it was in the Vietnamese jungle that something terrifying was discovered: a local strain of the Plasmodium parasite. Falciparum developed resistance to chloroquine, and the drug that military medics relied on as a reliable shield suddenly stopped working. The North Vietnamese army found itself in an even more vulnerable position, as supplying troops in the inaccessible jungle was extremely difficult. Malaria losses among North Vietnamese soldiers were reaching catastrophic proportions, and the command understood perfectly well that without effective treatment, it would be impossible to maintain the Army's combat readiness in the humid tropical climate. It was at this critical moment that North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh turned to his main ally, the People's Republic of China, for help. He personally asked Chairman Mao Zedong to help find a new drug against chloroquine-resistant malaria, as the disease threatened to undermine the country's military potential from within. This conversation between the two leaders set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to one of the greatest medical discoveries of the 20th century. China itself was no stranger to malaria. Its southern provinces suffered from it no less than the jungles of Vietnam. Moreover, the Chinese leadership saw solving this problem as an opportunity to demonstrate its scientific prowess while simultaneously supporting its ally in the ideologically important war against Western influence in the region. In the spring of 1967, Chairman Mao Zedong made a decision that seemed paradoxical in the era of space rockets and nuclear technology. He ordered a systematic study of the millennia-old legacy of traditional Chinese medicine in search of a cure for malaria. This decision was driven not by sentimentality, but by cold pragmatism. Modern Western pharmaceuticals had reached a dead end, and China had no other choice. The political context of this decision was no less important than the scientific one. The Cultural Revolution was underway, and the Chinese leadership was actively promoting the idea that traditional medicine was a valuable national treasure, equal to Western science. Moreover, the appeal to ancient archives fit perfectly with the official rhetoric about the superiority of Chinese civilization, ensuring the project political support at the highest levels. The fact is that by that time, traditional Chinese medicine had accumulated a colossal body of knowledge about medicinal plants, gathered over more than 2,000 years of continuous medical practice. One of the key sources of this knowledge was the grand treatise Ben Cao Ganmu, compiled in the 16th century by the scholar Li Shizhen, who systematized information on more than 1,800 medicinal substances of plant, animal, and mineral origin. However, researchers realized that a simple list of plants was not enough. They needed to find specific recipes describing preparation and application methods. This is why they turned to even more ancient texts, which contained not just herbal lists but detailed clinical observations of physicians who had treated malaria over many centuries. These texts were stored in libraries, monasteries, and archives across China, awaiting their time. Against the backdrop of the Cultural Revolution, when intellectuals were persecuted and universities were closed, the creation of a scientific program to study ancient medical texts seemed almost impossible. However, military necessity prevailed over ideological differences, and the state devoted significant resources to gathering the country's best scholars for this task. In the vaults of Chinese archives, researchers discovered a text more than 16 centuries old, and it was this text that ultimately pointed the way to the salvation of millions of people. Its author was Ge Hong, a man of remarkable destiny and encyclopedic intellect who lived in the 4th century CE. He was simultaneously an alchemist, a government official, and one of the most systematic medical thinkers of his time. Ge Hong compiled a treatise called Zhouhu Beiji Fang, which can be translated as Emergency Prescriptions Kept in the Sleeve. The title itself speaks to the author's practical intention. He wanted to create a compact reference book of emergency medicine that anyone could use in a critical situation, far from a doctor or a local pharmacy. This work is considered one of the first systematic medical reference books in Chinese history. Interestingly, Ge Hong wrote not as an armchair theorist, but as a practitioner who personally observed diseases and their treatments. His descriptions of malaria symptoms are strikingly accurate, even by modern medical standards: intermittent fever, chills, enlarged spleen, and debilitating weakness. It was this clinical precision that compelled researchers to take his prescriptions seriously. Among the many recipes in the treatise, researchers found a description of the treatment of malarial fever using a plant that Ge Hong called Qing Ho, which means green grass or blue wormwood. The recipe was laconic and seemingly simple. Take a bunch of Qing Hao, soak in water, squeeze out the juice, and drink. However, it was precisely this simplicity that concealed a detail that the researchers initially overlooked, and which cost them many months of wasted effort. You won't believe it, but the key word in Ge Hong's recipe wasn't the plant name or dosage, but a single instruction on the preparation method. He wrote, "Soak in water, not boil or simmer," and this difference between cold water and boiling water proved to be the difference between an effective medicine and a useless decoction. For 16 centuries, this instruction went unnoticed because no one thought the preparation method could be so crucial. The plant that Ge Hong wrote about is known in modern science under the Latin name Artemisia annua, or annual wormwood, has a history of continuous use in Chinese medicine spanning over 2,000 years. This tall, herbaceous plant with thin, feathery leaves and a characteristic bitter aroma can grow up to 2 meters in height and forms a dense biomass rich in biologically active compounds. The first written mentions of Qinghao as a medicinal plant appears in Chinese texts as early as the 2nd century BC, meaning that by the time Geihong included it in his reference book, the plant already had a centuries-old medicinal reputation. Chinese physicians used it not only against malarial fever, but also for other fevers, skin conditions, and as a digestive aid. This is why Geihong's treatise was perceived not as an exotic revelation, but as a record of an established medical tradition. In the grandiose treatise Bencao, in the 16th century Ganmu scholar Li Shijian also paid attention to Qinghao, occupied a significant place, describing its properties for reducing fever and stopping malarial attacks. His systematic work became a bridge between ancient recipes and the era of scientific research, preserving accumulated knowledge for posterity in a structured and accessible form. Moreover, it is thanks to Bencao Ganmu 20th century researchers were able to quickly identify the plant among hundreds of other candidates. However, the traditional use of Qinghao had one fundamental feature that modern researchers initially ignored. In traditional Chinese medicine, this plant was never subjected to prolonged heat treatment. It was either consumed fresh, steeped in cold water, or used in preparations that did not require boiling. This was not an accident or a technological gap, but a practice intuitively developed over centuries that preserved the active ingredient intact. In fact, the gap between traditional knowledge and modern laboratory practice proved fatal to the first experiments. Scientists, accustomed to standard extraction methods that rely on heating for more complete extraction of substances, unknowingly destroyed the very compound they were seeking. Tradition guarded the secret, but it was conveyed in the language of practice, not chemical formulas. And that's why translating this knowledge into scientific terms was so labor-intensive. May 23rd, 1900. In 1967, a meeting was held in Beijing that remained unknown to the general public for decades. On that day, the Chinese government officially launched a secret military medical program codenamed Project 500. 23 years after its founding, the program had a single goal: to find a new, effective treatment for chloroquine-resistant malaria in the shortest possible time. The project's scale was truly national. More than 500 scientists from 60 research institutes located throughout China, from Beijing to the remote southern provinces, were involved. Military medical institutions, pharmaceutical laboratories, and university departments also joined the program, turning the 5000 project into a truly comprehensive project. 23 in one of the largest coordinated scientific programs in the history of the country. The work was conducted in two parallel complementary directions. The first was purely modern. Chemists systematically synthesized and tested new chemical compounds in search of a molecule capable of killing the parasite. The second direction looked to the past. Medical historians and pharmacologists methodically studied ancient texts, searching for references to plants and preparations used against malarial fever for millennia. During the course of their work on the first line, researchers tested over 240,000 chemical compounds, but none demonstrated sufficient effectiveness against the resistant parasite strain. This is why the second line, initially viewed with skepticism by some scientists, gradually gained increasing importance. The failure of modern chemistry paradoxically strengthened the position of those who believed in the wisdom of ancient medical archives. The project existed in conditions of the utmost secrecy for several reasons. On the one hand, it was a military development, linked to actual combat operations in Vietnam. On the other hand, during the Cultural Revolution, the very appeal to historical texts and traditional knowledge could be interpreted controversially from a political perspective. This is why the research results were not published in the open scientific literature, and only became known to the world many years after the war ended. Among the hundreds of scientists working on Project 523, a new head of the Traditional Medicine Research Group emerged in 1969. This person was Tu Yuyu, an employee of the China Academy of Traditional Chinese Medicine in Beijing, and it was her appointment that ultimately determined the fate of the entire project. Tu Youyou was a scientist of rare caliber. She had studied both Western pharmacology and traditional Chinese medicine at Beijing Medical University. This combination of two scientific traditions, often seen as incompatible at the time, proved to be precisely the tool needed to solve the problem. Having received the assignment, Tu Youyou and her small team began a systematic analysis of ancient medical sources. They examined over 2,000 ancient medicinal recipes, selecting those that mentioned treating malarial fever and related symptoms. This monumental effort resulted in a list of approximately 600 plants worthy of laboratory testing. At the same time, the team conducted field expeditions in the southern provinces of China, where malaria was widespread, and collected information from local healers who had passed down recipes orally for generations. Tu Youyou understood that living traditions can preserve details missing from any written source, and so she treated every such testimony as a potentially valuable clue. Each of the selected plants required laboratory testing on mice infected with the malaria parasite, and the team methodically worked through their list, recording the results of each experiment. Moreover, when the first tests of the How yielded disappointing results, no one crossed him off the list definitively, and this decision turned out to be fateful. The laboratory journals of the Tu Youyou team from 1969 and 1970 are a chronicle of successive disappointments. Dozens of experiments with Qing extract How gave unstable and contradictory results. In some experiments, the plant showed weak activity against the parasite. In others, it had no effect at all. This is why some members of the team began to doubt whether it was worth continuing to work with this plant. The problem lay in the extraction method. Standard laboratory practice at the time involved using high temperatures to more completely extract active substances from plant materials, and the researchers were unwittingly applying the same approach to zinc. However, it was precisely boiling and prolonged heating that destroyed the very compound they were seeking, turning the potentially healing extract into a useless liquid. In 1971, Tu Youyou returned to Ge Hong's text and reread it with renewed attention. It was then that she particularly noticed that the ancient physician wrote not boil, but soak in water, using a formulation that clearly indicated a cold preparation method. This observation upended the entire logic of the experiments and pointed to a fundamental error the team had been making for many months. The active compound, artemisinin, is destroyed by heating above 60 degrees Celsius, making it extremely sensitive to standard extraction methods. Just imagine, for 16 centuries, an ancient text preserved this knowledge in the form of a simple, practical instruction, and only a scholar who could read between the lines of medical tradition could discern the chemical clue within it. Tu Youyou changed the extraction method, switching to low-temperature extraction using diethyl ether, and the results immediately improved. In October 1971, an experiment was 100% effective against the malaria parasite in laboratory mice. This result was so unexpected after a long series of failures that the team repeated the experiment several times before believing their own data. Moreover, each repeat test confirmed the same thing. The low-temperature zinc extract How destroyed the parasite completely and without a trace. Having obtained compelling results in laboratory animals, the team faced a question that in modern science requires months of bureaucratic approval. Was the extract safe for human use? Given the military urgency and secrecy of the project, waiting was impossible. And so Tu Youyou made a decision that today would be considered incredibly risky. She voluntarily tested the drug on herself. Along with several colleagues, Tu Youyou agreed to become the first person to take the purified Qing extract. How as a test subject? This was a calculated risk. Despite the plant's centuries-old tradition of use in folk medicine, no one knew how the concentrated low-temperature extract would behave in the human body, or whether it would be toxic in its new form. That's why the scientists monitored their condition with the utmost care, recording every change in their well-being. The self-experiment was successful, no serious side effects were detected, and the team obtained initial data on the drug's safety for humans. Just imagine the degree of personal responsibility these people shouldered. They sacrificed their own health to speed up the development of a drug desperately needed by soldiers in the jungle and millions of sick people across China. This act remains one of the most impressive examples of scientific self-sacrifice of the 20th century. Following the successful self-experiment, the first clinical trials on patients with confirmed malaria were conducted in 1972. 21 people suffering from acute attacks of malarial fever participated in the study, and all demonstrated rapid and complete recovery after taking the drug. The results were so convincing that they left no room for doubt. The ancient plant truly contained what modern science was searching for. Furthermore, the drug's speed of action astonished even seasoned clinicians. Artemisinin reduced fever and eliminated symptoms significantly faster than any other anti-malarial drug known at the time. This quality was particularly important in military settings where quickly restoring soldiers' combat capability was a matter of strategic importance. This is why military command immediately took an interest in the research results and accelerated further testing. For many years, Tuyuyu's discovery remained virtually unknown outside of China, as the results of Project 523 were not published in international scientific journals for security reasons. Western pharmaceuticals continued to search for a solution to the malaria problem through their own means, unaware that it had already been discovered in secret Beijing laboratories. This paradox of scientific isolation cost humanity many years and many lives. Only in 1979, after the end of the Vietnam War and the gradual opening of China to the world, did the first scientific publications on artemisinin begin to appear in accessible sources. However, the international medical community initially greeted these results with caution. Western scientists found it difficult to accept the idea that the solution to one of humanity's greatest medical problems could be derived from an ancient 4th century text. Moreover, Cold War-era political barriers significantly slowed the exchange of scientific data between China and Western countries. The World Health Organization recognized artemisinin and artemisinin-based combination therapies as the standard treatment for malaria only in 2004, more than 30 years after their initial discovery. This recognition marked a revolution in global anti-malarial medicine. Artemisinin-based drugs began to be distributed en masse to countries in Africa and Asia, where malaria continued to claim hundreds of thousands of lives annually. That's why many global health experts call this decision one of the most important in the history of the World Health Organization. In 2015, Tuyuyu was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, becoming the first Chinese citizen to receive this award for scientific research conducted in China itself. The Nobel Committee particularly emphasized that artemisinin was the first major drug developed from traditional Chinese medicine to achieve global scientific recognition. Interestingly, Tuyuyu was 84 years old when she received the prize, making her one of the oldest laureates in the history of the award. The Nobel Prize ceremony drew widespread attention to the discovery and, for the first time, introduced a global audience to the full story. The secret military program, Ge Hong's ancient text, the scientist's self-experimentation, and decades of scientific isolation. Believe it or not, many of Tuyuyu's Chinese colleagues learned the details of the discovery from international reports about the Nobel Prize. So deeply was the information about Project 523 buried in secret archives. To understand why artemisinin proved such an effective weapon against the malaria parasite, we need to delve deeper into molecular interactions and see a picture that resembles a military ambush rather than a typical chemical reaction. The artemisinin molecule contains an unusual structural element that chemists call an endoperoxide bridge. Two oxygen atoms linked together in a specific way. It's this detail that turns the molecule into something of a chemical time bomb. When the malaria parasite Plasmodium penetrates a human red blood cell, it begins to digest hemoglobin, releasing an iron-containing compound called heme. This iron is a critical element in the parasite's metabolism, but it is precisely this iron that becomes its undoing upon contact with artemisinin. Iron activates the endoperoxide bridge of the artemisinin molecule, triggering a chain reaction that generates highly toxic free radicals directly inside the parasite cell. The free radicals produced by this reaction attack the parasite's proteins and membranes from the inside, disrupting its vital functions faster than it can develop defense mechanisms. Moreover, this entire process occurs exclusively within infected cells, as this is where the iron that activates the molecule is concentrated. Healthy human cells, which do not contain such concentrations of free heme, remain virtually unaffected. This is why artemisinin exhibits remarkable selectivity. It destroys the parasite with surgical precision without causing significant harm to the host. Just imagine the elegance of this mechanism. The parasite itself activates the molecule that destroys itself, using its own metabolic process as the trigger for its own demise. The ancient plant developed this compound over millions of years of evolution, and it took humanity 2,000 years of medical practice and several decades of modern science to understand exactly how it works. Furthermore, the speed of artemisinin's action at the molecular level explains its clinical superiority over older drugs. Quinine and chloroquine acted relatively slowly, giving the parasite time to adapt and develop resistance mechanisms. Artemisinin, however, attacks so rapidly and so many targets simultaneously that the parasite simply doesn't have time to mount an adequate defense response, making the development of resistance to this drug significantly more challenging for Plasmodium. Artemisinin-based combination therapies began to be widely used in countries with high malaria incidence. Mortality statistics changed so dramatically that epidemiologists initially double-checked their data, distrusting their own calculations. According to the World Health Organization, the widespread introduction of these drugs in the 2000s and 2010s saved millions of lives, with the greatest impact achieved in sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria has traditionally claimed the largest number of lives. Child mortality rates were particularly striking. Artemisinin-based therapies. Malaria was one of the leading causes of death among children under 5 in tropical regions, killing hundreds of thousands of young patients annually, with modern medicine powerless to save them. This is why global health considers the introduction of artemisinin-based therapies one of the most significant achievements in the fight against childhood mortality over the past half-century. Interestingly, the success of artemisinin has transformed not only medical practice but also the global malaria control strategy. The World Health Organization has developed ambitious malaria elimination programs in several regions, relying on the effectiveness of combination therapies as the cornerstone of these strategies. Moreover, countries that seemed hopelessly engulfed by endemic malaria as recently as the 1990s began to show a steady decline in incidence by tens of % per year. However, the drug's global distribution has presented humanity with a new challenge, one that scientists had anticipated from the very beginning. The widespread and not always appropriate use of artemisinin monotherapy, that is, without combination with other anti-malarial drugs, created conditions for the gradual development of parasite resistance to the active substance. In Southeast Asia, primarily in Cambodia and Myanmar, the first cases of reduced susceptibility of Plasmodium were recorded as early as 2010. Falciparum to artemisinin, which has caused serious concern in the scientific community. This is why the World Health Organization advocates exclusively for combination therapies, which combine artemisinin with drugs with a different mechanism of action, significantly reducing the risk of developing resistance. This recommendation has sparked heated debate about treatment accessibility, as combination therapies are significantly more expensive than simple plant extracts and are inaccessible to a significant portion of the population in the world's poorest countries. In fact, this conflict between scientific caution and humanitarian necessity has become one of the central contradictions of modern global medicine. The discovery of artemisinin gave rise not only to a medical revolution, but also to an entirely new pharmaceutical market, the scale of which continues to grow every year. According to analytical companies Grand View. According to Research and Market Watch, the global market for artemisinin-based antimalarial drugs is valued in the billions of dollars, and is demonstrating steady growth, driven by both geographic expansion and the development of new formulations. This is why the world's largest pharmaceutical corporations are increasingly interested in this market segment. For many years, the only source of artemisinin was the Artemisia annua plant itself, and pharmaceutical companies were entirely dependent on agricultural production. The main suppliers of Artemisia annua leaves were China, Vietnam, and several African countries where the climate allowed for industrial-scale cultivation. However, dependence on natural raw materials created a serious problem. Yields varied from season to season, market prices were unstable, and production could not always keep up with growing demand. It was this instability that prompted scientists to search for alternative methods of producing artemisinin, and in 2013, the American biotechnology company Amyris announced the development of a technology for producing semi-synthetic artemisinin using genetically modified yeast. However, the emergence of synthetic artemisinin sparked an unexpected wave of controversy. Farmers in China, Vietnam, and Africa, who had already built entire industries around growing Artemisia annua, were threatened with losing their market. Furthermore, some experts warned that synthetic production would consolidate control of the vital drug in the hands of a few large corporations, potentially leading to higher prices and reduced accessibility for poor countries. In fact, this conflict has exposed a profound contradiction between technological progress and social justice in the global pharmaceutical industry. Interestingly, the market has never fully transitioned to synthetic artemisinin, and natural plant-based raw materials remain the most important source of the active ingredient for most manufacturers. This is explained by both economic factors and the technical difficulties of scaling biotech production to a level capable of meeting global demand. This is why the fate of millions of malaria patients worldwide still largely depends on the success of the annual wormwood harvest in the fields of China and Africa. Amid the debate over synthetic production and pharmaceutical corporations, a completely different movement was quietly developing around the world, offering a radically simple solution to the problem of drug availability. Small organizations and enthusiastic agronomists began teaching farmers in the poorest regions of Africa how to grow Artemisia annua directly on their own plots, turning their gardens into personal apothecaries. The idea seemed too simple to be true, but its simplicity was precisely its strength. The German nonprofit organization ANAMED, which stands for Action for Natural Medicine, has become one of the main proponents of this approach and has, over the years, trained farmers and health workers in dozens of African countries in the technology of growing and using the plant. ANAMED program was based on the simple fact that Artemisia annua is an easy-to-grow and fast-growing plant, capable of reaching 2 meters in height in a single growing season and producing significant amounts of biomass even in poor soils. This makes growing this plant affordable even for the poorest households in rural Africa. Proponents of home cultivation pointed to the obvious advantages of this approach. The plant does not require complex equipment, expensive fertilizers, or specialized agronomic knowledge, and its leaves can be used to prepare tea or infusions directly at home. Moreover, in regions where pharmacies are tens of kilometers away and purchasing certified medications is impossible due to poverty, having your own Artemisia annua plant in your garden could literally mean the difference between life and death for a sick child. However, it was precisely here that the home-growing movement faced fierce opposition from international medical organizations and the pharmaceutical community. The World Health Organization officially discourages the use of herbal remedies based on Artemisia annua as a substitute for certified medications, citing the impossibility of controlling the concentration of the active ingredient in homemade infusions. This is because the artemisinin content in the plant's leaves varies significantly depending on the variety, growing conditions, harvest time, and preparation method, making precise dosing virtually impossible at home. Proponents of standardization warn that incorrect dosing is one of the main factors contributing to the development of parasite resistance to artemisinin. If a patient receives an insufficient amount of the active substance, the parasite is able to survive and adapt, gradually developing populations resistant to the drug. This is why the conflict between proponents of home growing and defenders of standardized production is not just a dispute about preferences, but a fundamental contradiction with serious implications for global health. While the medical community debated the availability of anti-malarial drugs, a group of researchers posed an unexpected question. If artemisinin kills the malaria parasite through a reaction with iron, could it act similarly on other cells with elevated iron levels? The answer to this question opened a completely new field of oncology and compelled scientists around the world to take a completely different look at this humble plant from the fields of China. The fact is that cancer cells absorb iron much more actively than healthy cells, as they require iron for rapid division and growth. This property of tumor cells theoretically made them vulnerable to the same mechanism that artemisinin uses against the malaria parasite. Increased iron levels would activate the molecule and direct its destructive action against the tumor itself. In 2001, researchers at the University of Washington tested this hypothesis in a laboratory setting and obtained results that immediately attracted the attention of the oncology community. In their experiments, the Washington scientists discovered that artemisinin was capable of killing breast cancer cells with astonishing efficiency, and its selectivity for tumor cells compared to healthy cells was quite high. Moreover, when researchers pre-saturate cancer cells with iron, the effectiveness of artemisinin increased manifold, confirming the iron-dependent mechanism of its anti-tumor action. These results sparked a wave of research worldwide, and today, the anti-cancer potential of artemisinin is being studied in dozens of laboratories across multiple continents. However, wormwood's antiparasitic properties are not limited to its effect on the malaria parasite in humans, and veterinary research has uncovered another unexpected use for this plant. Scientists have discovered that Artemisia annua effectively reduces the infestation of sheep with a parasite called Haemonchus contortus, which is one of the most dangerous intestinal parasites in sheep farming and annually causes enormous economic losses to farms worldwide. This is why agronomists and veterinarians in several countries have begun to consider including Artemisia annua in animal diets as a promising method for combating parasitic diseases without the use of chemical anthelmintics. Interestingly, this entire spectrum of biological activity, from anti-malarial to anti-cancer and anti-parasitic effects, is united by a single molecular mechanism based on a reaction with iron and the generation of free radicals. This means that the plant, which Chinese physicians used to treat fever 2,000 years ago, may be the source of a whole family of medicinal compounds applicable in a wide range of medical fields. Moreover, scientists believe that the full therapeutic potential of Artemisia annua is far from being exhausted and awaits further exploration. Artemisia genus would be incomplete without the story of another member of its genus, who, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, found herself at the center of one of the most notorious cultural and political scandals in the history of European civilization. This is Artemisia absinthium, the bitter wormwood from which the legendary drink absinthe was made, and whose history is a striking example of how a plant can be destroyed not by disease or natural disasters, but by human interests and fears. In the final decades of the 19th century, absinthe was a true symbol of Bohemian culture in Paris and throughout French-speaking Europe. Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud drank it, Edgar Degas depicted it in his paintings, Oscar Wilde celebrated it in his essays, and Vincent van Gogh considered it an integral part of his creative life. Just imagine the atmosphere of Parisian cafes of that time, where artists, poets, and philosophers sipped the cloudy green drink at marble tables and debated art, politics, and the meaning of existence. However, at the beginning of the 20th century, a concerted campaign against absinthe unfolded, portraying it as a deadly poison that corrupted the mind and drove people to insane acts. Newspapers published harrowing stories of crimes allegedly committed under the influence of absinthe. Doctors issued warnings about its extreme toxicity, and moralists demanded an immediate ban. In 1915, France banned the production and sale of absinthe, and most other European countries followed suit within a few years. The main culprit in this story was the compound thujone, found in wormwood and known to have neurotoxic properties when consumed in large doses. Absinthe's opponents claimed that thujone caused hallucinations, seizures, and mental disorders, turning a moderate drinker into a dangerous lunatic. These accusations became firmly entrenched in the public consciousness and were perceived for decades as scientifically proven fact, although the actual research at that time was extremely superficial and methodologically weak. Interestingly, economic historians studying this era have noted a remarkable coincidence. The anti-absinthe campaign unfolded simultaneously with powerful lobbying by the French wine industry, which was losing its market due to the growing popularity of the significantly cheaper drink. Winemakers financed anti-absinthe organizations, supported publications about the dangers of wormwood, and actively promoted legal prohibition through political connections. This is why many researchers today view the ban on absinthe not so much as a victory for public health, but rather as a triumph of economic lobbying over scientific objectivity. The ban on absinthe lasted in most European countries for nearly a century, and throughout this time, the image of a sinister green drink driving people mad lived on in cultural memory as a matter of course. However, in the 1990s, a group of scientists decided to test the initial accusations against thujone using modern analytical methods, and the results were sensational. In fact, everything the public knew about absinthe and its dangers needed a serious rethink. The researchers analyzed surviving original bottles of 19th-century absinthe, which were kept in private collections and museums, and measured the actual thujone content in these historic samples, the thujone madness theory. The concentration of this compound in historical samples of absinthe was so low that it could not have caused any neurotoxic effects even with significant consumption. Moreover, the thujone content in absinthe was comparable to that found in a number of common culinary herbs that no one had ever considered banning. Further research revealed that the symptoms once attributed to thujone were much better explained by ordinary alcohol poisoning, as absinthe was 70% alcohol by volume or more. In other words, the artists and poets of Bohemian Paris were suffering not from the mythical thujone madness, but from the quite normal consequences of drinking very strong alcohol in large quantities. This is why modern toxicologists unanimously consider the theory of thujone's particular danger in absinthe a scientific myth, born of a combination of moral panic and economic self-interest. Armed with this scientific evidence, enthusiasts and producers launched a campaign to legally rehabilitate absinthe, and in 2007 the European Union officially authorized the production and sale of the drink, subject to compliance with the maximum permissible thujone content. Switzerland, the historical birthplace of absinthe, legalized it even earlier, in 2005, and local distillers immediately resumed production using historical recipes. Furthermore, in the following years, absinthe experienced a veritable cultural renaissance. Hundreds of new brands appeared, specialized bars, and a whole community of collectors and connoisseurs. The story of absinthe's rehabilitation has significance far beyond the world of alcoholic beverages, as it is a clear example of how scientific truth can be suppressed for decades under the pressure of economic interests and public fears. Believe it or not, the plant, demonized as a source of madness and banned in most civilized countries, actually turned out to be no more dangerous than many other herbs sold freely on any market. This is precisely why this story resonates so poignantly with contemporary debates about the regulation of herbal medicines. The stories of absinthe and artemisinin, despite their differences, point to the same fundamental question, one that is becoming increasingly pressing in the modern world. Who has the right to control people's access to plants that have been used as medicines for millennia, long before the advent of pharmaceutical corporations and regulatory agencies? This question ceased to be an abstract philosophical one when it began to impact the real lives of millions of people in the world's poorest countries. That's why debates over the standardization and availability of herbal medicines are now being waged not only in scientific journals, but also in the boardrooms of the United Nations. On one side of this debate are global health experts and pharmaceutical regulators, whose arguments are based on real scientific risks. They point out that non-standardized herbal remedies can contain unpredictable concentrations of active ingredients, creating the risk of both overdose and under-therapeutic dosage. Furthermore, subtherapeutic doses of artemisinin in home infusions are cited as one of the factors contributing to the development of resistant strains of the malaria parasite, threatening to undo decades of medical progress. On the other side are advocates for drug access, public organizations, and representatives of the poorest communities, who ask a simple and uncomfortable question. What's better for a child with malaria in a remote village? A non-standardized homemade infusion made from garden-grown Artemisia annua, or no treatment at all, because the certified medication costs more than the family earns in a week. This is why many humanitarian medicine specialists consider the World Health Organization's position to be overly harsh, given the real living conditions of people in the world's poorest regions. The fact is that the drug certification and standardization system, developed in rich countries for rich countries, is poorly adapted to the reality of places where malaria kills children every day. Completing the full cycle of clinical trials, registration, and certification takes many years and millions of dollars, making this process inaccessible to local manufacturers and public organizations in Africa. Moreover, even after registration, the price of a certified drug often remains unaffordable for those who need it most. Interestingly, this conflict has another dimension that is rarely discussed openly: the question of whose knowledge is considered legitimate in the modern medical system. Traditional knowledge about medicinal plants, accumulated over hundreds of generations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, does not fit the standards of evidence-based medicine simply because it has never been subjected to randomized, controlled trials. However, it was this knowledge that led to the discovery of artemisinin, and this is why the story of Tu Youyou is not just the biography of a scientist, but also an argument in the ongoing debate about the value of traditional wisdom in the face of modern science. The history of Artemisia annua, which has traveled from the gardens of ancient China through the secret laboratories of Beijing to the Nobel Prize and the fields of Africa, ultimately leads us to a question that concerns every person on the planet. Regardless of where they live and how far they are from the nearest pharmacy, this question sounds simple, but its simplicity conceals one of the deepest conflicts of modern civilization. Do plants, which nature has been creating for millions of years and humans have been using for millennia, belong to all of humanity, or to those who first patented their active compounds? Just imagine the full trajectory of this history in its true scope. The malaria parasite has coexisted with humans for hundreds of thousands of years and has claimed more lives than all wars in human history combined. Chinese doctors discovered a weapon against it 2,000 years ago and passed this knowledge down from generation to generation in the form of a simple, practical recipe. Ge Hong wrote down this recipe in the 4th century with the sole purpose of allowing anyone in need to use it without a doctor or a pharmacy, literally carrying the instructions in the sleeve of their robe. 16 centuries later, a military crisis in the Vietnamese jungles prompted Chinese scholars to return to this text, and Tu Youyou discovered what had been hidden in plain sight: a simple instruction not to boil the plant, which preserved the active ingredient intact. This discovery was a triumph not only for modern science, but also for the very idea that the knowledge accumulated by humanity over millennia deserves the same serious attention as the results of the most advanced laboratory research. Moreover, the 2015 Nobel Prize officially recognized traditional Chinese medicine as the source of a globally significant discovery for the first time in history. However, the triumph of artemisinin is accompanied by a profound controversy that has never been resolved. A plant available to every farmer in a tropical climate, whose recipe was written for anyone to use in an emergency, is now at the center of a debate over patents, standardization, and access control. Millions of people in the world's poorest countries are dying from a disease for which a cure literally grows under their feet. Yet international medical organizations discourage them from using this plant directly. That's why the history of Artemisia annua is a mirror reflecting all the contradictions of modern global medicine. The history of absinthe adds another important dimension to this picture, reminding us that the demonization of plants is rarely accidental and almost always has economic beneficiaries. Wormwood was banned not because science had proven its dangers, but because its popularity threatened the profits of others. And this ban lasted for nearly a century despite the lack of any real scientific basis. In fact, this history lesson should make us more wary of any campaigns to restrict access to natural medicinal resources and ask the uncomfortable question of whose interests lie behind each such restriction. Ultimately, the history of the Artemisia genus, from ancient Chinese gardens to modern pharmaceutical laboratories and African vegetable gardens, is a story about the nature of knowledge and who owns it. Geihong wrote his treatise to make knowledge accessible to everyone. Tu Youyou dedicated her life to ensuring this knowledge was scientifically validated. And today, as artemisinin saves millions of lives and debates over drug access continue, the most important question remains: will humanity be able to find a balance between scientific rigor and humanitarian necessity, between quality control and the right of every person to access the knowledge bequeathed to them by nature and their ancestors?